Yeah, it's an exciting time for me to be here with Naomi. A year ago, for our very first issue of Amaze magazine, the theme was women. And in every issue, we feature an interview with someone who can bear upon the topic with like quite a bit of relevance and intelligence. And we were very lucky to have Naomi be featured as one of those interviews in Amaze magazine issue number 1. Issue number 3, you've probably seen it at the entrance. Grab a copy, let us know what you think. And now 1 year later, we have Naomi with us here in person. Hi, Naomi.
Hi, I'm really excited to be here. This is my first time in Berlin, so I'm really grateful to Amaze for having me here.
Yay, we are really happy to have you here too. So, Naomi, we're going to bring you to the city of Berlin and to the people of Amaze. Where were you born?
Oh, I was born in California, in Southern California, right near Los Angeles. Yeah, although I didn't live there for very long. Actually, my parents are academics, and so but not long after I was born, we moved to London, where my father was doing postdoctoral studies. But then most of my childhood, I grew up in Seattle.
And where were your parents born?
So my mother is from Yokohama, Japan, and my father's also from Southern California, so he was born and raised there.
So when did games enter your life?
Oh, yeah. So I remember the first game I played is a game called Push Button, which you play is a game that a child plays with an adult's face. So this is a traditional game that we play in my family. So you sit the child on your lap if you're the adult playing, and then the child can push different parts of the adult's face, and then different unexpected things happen. So if you, for instance, if you push
How old were you?
Maybe 2 or 3. So, and I realized much later, oh, this is actually quite an interesting game that has relevance for modern digital games in the way we think about interactivity now. So when you push the nose and maybe, like tongue comes out, you push the cheek and the tongue goes this way. Yeah, so it's you could say a simple touch screen with unpredictable interactivity that's, created on the fly by the game designer in the person of a parent or adult relative.
Your work spans so many disciplines. You've done things in, documentary journalism. You've done quite a bit in intersectional politics, intersectional activism. You are a game designer. You code. You've made card games. What gets you out of bed every day?
Oh, well, that's usually, I guess, some coffee, but but in terms of thinking about games, usually it's just that. I always have another next game in my head that's wanting to get out. Usually it's a little bit locked up or constipated, I guess, by too many games that I'm already working on or have committed to finishing. So that motivates me to get work done. It's like, okay, I've got to get the current project finished, and I have these are some of the games I've worked on. I think I've been trying to keep a better track lately. I think I've maybe worked on about 38 released games now. And they span all sorts of things. A lot of the games on the screen I was making for clients, some even as part of an advertising project. Some of them are my own work, of course. But even when I'm doing my own work, like the game I'm working on right now, Consentacle, I'm very aware that, okay, I actually need to get it finished and put it out into the world so that there's actually room for the next game to come out. Otherwise, I think maybe my soul would become blackened from too many games stopped up inside.
Right, and speaking of Consentacle, I don't know how many people in our audience already know about that. This is the sex part that Francisca warned everybody about. You may want to leave if it bothers you too much to see alien tentacle sex.
So pardon me, it's a little awkward since I'm not able to see this on my screen, but we can bring some pictures up.
There we go.
Yeah, so this is the project I've been working on for, I guess, unfortunately, almost 2 years now. I started working on it two summers ago because I was commissioned to make a game for a show that we have every year in New York called No Quarter. Actually, Robert Yang, who's sitting over here, is the current curator of No Quarter, right? Yeah. And Yeah, and so I was commissioned 2 years ago to make a game as part of this exhibition. Every year, the curator asks for local artists in New York to make a game. It can be digital or non-digital, and so I had this idea kicking around in my head for a while, so I decided it was a good opportunity to make it. And so this first version that you see on the screen here is the version that was developed basically for a gallery show, for an event space where people would come maybe a little bit drunk and play with complete strangers or friends. And so I've been figuring out ever since then, I guess, much more slowly than during that initial burst of deadline-induced creativity to decide what's happening next in the future versions of this game, and how it would have to change in order to become maybe a little bit a product that someone might want to give me some money to get it printed and take home and maybe play multiple times.
So for those of us who don't know yet and who can't guess from the images, Consentacle is a card game about consensual sex between a human and an alien that has tentacles. It's not easily classifiable when you have a game that's about sex that is not a sex game. What direction has it taken since a year ago?
Yeah, so the basic game, so it doesn't directly represent sex, except as you see on the cards, maybe you can see in some of these images, there's a little bit of licking and biting going on. But I wanted to make it not a completely explicit game because I knew that it was going to potentially be played by people who were meeting each other for the first time or didn't know each other well. And I was very aware that in the world of non-digital games, tabletop games, card games, there is this genre. Maybe the most commonly encountered genre of game about sex are these terrible games that you can buy in sex stores with maybe some dice that you roll, and it says one dice you roll to say elbow, and the die you roll and it would say stroke. And so like now you're supposed to stroke the other player's elbow. So it's a game that's very literally meant to be played during sex. And then we have, of course, a lot of other games that represent sex as part of a story, or you can choose in some role-playing games. Who do you want to have sex with? I think like this kind of Mass Effect scene. That's the other face of sex in games. That it's all about just representing different kinds of relationships. So this is maybe the most common way people think about queer relationships in games. But I wanted to make a game that was also commenting on sex and maybe dealing with some of the difficulties of sex. I think Robert was giving a talk yesterday where he talked about one of my earlier sex games, which is this game called Sex Mix, which actually is intended to be played while you're having sex, but it makes your sex much, much worse. And I think that's maybe just a more interesting thing to do than trying to give people ideas of what to do during sex. Instead, it's an obstacle to your sex life. Because I think that the best thing games can do with these facets of our lives that they're engaging with is maybe force us to reflect a little bit on what's going on and not just naturalize everything or say like, oh, it's wonderful if you stroke my elbow because of a random number generator. This was from maybe almost 10 years ago now that I worked on this game. But then when I was trying to think about how to represent consent in games, and that was really maybe the starting point for Consentacle, and there were it was really provoked by this game called Tentacle Bento, which is a game about tentacled monsters raping schoolgirls, and that's the goal of the game, is for you to capture these busty anime-styled co-eds as a tentacled monster that's never, I don't think never fully shown or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So Consentacle is a response to this game, really, and saying, okay, well, we could actually engage with these types of subjects of alien bodies, what it means to be coming from very different places in our experiences of sex or bodies, and how to negotiate that with each other.
It's a quite interesting reclamation on an actually quite horrible, perverse idea where you rape schoolgirls. Was that something you intentionally wanted to do, to reclaim alien bodies and sex?
Yeah, so this was very striking to me. especially because when I was growing up, actually maybe around the time I was leaving high school or entering college, that was when this genre of tentacle porn started being exported and translated out of Japanese. And so I was aware of this type of, ecchi or hentai content in Japan. But then it was quite a different experience to be living in the United States and have it arrive here and then have everyone become aware of it. It almost became this joke like, oh, well, that's what Japanese people do is, you sit down to dinner with your family and, you're watching some tentacle porn. Japan is so weird. Everyone there is a pervert. And so as a pervert, I have a complex relationship with that idea because I think it is extremely racist in some ways. But at the same time, I found it really unfortunate that the genre of tentacle porn was kind of born out of restrictions on pornography in Japan, that they were unable to show, especially male genitals, I think was where the main prohibition was. And so even in live action pornography for many years, they would have a special stick with a disc on the end that they would hold in front of porn actors' genitals to obscure them. And then the relative freedom of depiction in anime meant that they still couldn't draw human genitals, but they could come up with genital substitutes. And I always like this idea of genital substitutes. I actually find it a kind of queer reimagining of sex, but the fact that it was all turned towards rape, towards non-consensual sex, as opposed to, these are some, you see here this famous painting by Hokusai, which is, some people claim is kind of the origin of this tentacle sex theme in Japan, and this is actually depicting a consensual relationship. And the fact that it was turned towards or associated with rape, I found really unfortunate and made me very unhappy because I think these kinds of reimagining of what bodies and genitals look like has actually been pretty influential on me. This is actually by Ginger Takahashi Brooks, another Japanese-American artist who I know. It's just sort of thinking about the strangeness of bodies and other permutations that we could imagine. And so when I saw this Kickstarter come out, maybe about 4 years ago now, I thought, well, why couldn't you do a better version of this game? Why couldn't we actually explore what it means to develop consent between beings who are really different? And that might actually lead us to an interesting place to talking about sex in our own lives or actually negotiating a fictionalized sexual encounter even with someone that we've just met. And to my surprise, this has worked very well. It's not so pornographic or intimate that you can't play it with a stranger. And I've seen, even some pretty tough guy, like teenage boys play it with each other. Like the last people you would expect to be like, okay, yeah, why not? And I think that's a little bit because of the distance created when you have these fictional characters, and that's why most of the time that was spent putting this project together was figuring out what these cards would look like, and it was quite important that we had these characters that are very not meant to be you, but that you're sort of piloting them. So I see
this as a reclamation in two senses. One of it being about consent explicitly, especially in the title, but also just visually. I think James Harvey, what he managed to do for Consentacle was to bring a sort of Japanese anime style to it, so not disowning the heritage of Japan necessarily, but bringing it to the next level where it's not icky, it's not gross, it's not perverse. I think he did a pretty good job.
Right, yeah, and that's something we talked a lot about. We actually, that was maybe where we went through the most drafts and revisions, figuring out exactly how explicit it should be. I have some drafts on this laptop that I could show of the more explicit, more X-rated versions of some of these cards, but I deliberately steered away from that. And I'm glad too, because then, when you're showing a game like this in a public space, and it's been shown in museums and galleries, and there are always some kids that walk up and want to play it. And
I think, this game about?
Yeah, exactly. And well, one of my original goals is actually to see if I could make a family-friendly sex game. And I think it's almost there. The only really explicit thing is that one of the cards is called Penetrates, which you have to play in a combo with a card called Envelop. And Yeah, and so that's maybe the most explicit thing, and everything else you see there is, there's a lot of very suggestive material, but actually I've had parents standing over their 10-year-old children playing this game, and they don't seem to be too bothered. So
Have you gotten reactions from Japanese people?
Yeah, so I was interviewed actually when this game came out by some Japanese journalists who were interested in the idea that it was reclaiming this sort of hentai genre. I think the attitude about hentai porn is quite different in Japan versus in the United States and maybe here as well. There's places that it's been exported to. Because my sense has always been from living in Japan when I was younger and staying in touch with that culture that I wouldn't say it's celebrated as part of Japanese culture, but it's kind of like, okay, yeah, that's there. We know that's there. It's fine. We tolerate it. We kind of think, yeah, we don't really talk about that. Maybe you're engaged in, or you reading hentai comics on the subway or something. We just kind of ignore that you're doing that. But it's not something that we're tremendously proud of or excited by. So there was a little bit of that attitude, like, oh, this is interesting. This Japanese American game designer is working with this stuff. I think it was also maybe a little bit. Yeah, they didn't quite know what to make of it because it's not an ecchi game, which would be a game that's intended for sexual stimulation. So it doesn't fit neatly into these categories that have been established there for saying like, okay, this is a private thing you're doing by yourself. Like, okay, everybody is pooping and masturbating, but we don't talk about it.
You're navigating so many markets here. You're navigating kind of like family-friendly sex. It's not a sex game, but it is about sex. How is that going for you, the marketing and the publishing?
Well, I thought it would be terrible. I just thought this was going to fail because I was trying to have my cake and eat it too. But it's worked much better than I thought. In fact, I was a little bit unprepared for the fact that people seem to enjoy playing it in public. You don't necessarily have to. They don't have to be drunk even. This was surprising to me. That strangers and kids could play it, and the people seem to understand the idea quickly. So I must have stumbled onto doing something right just out of instinct, and maybe I can credit having worked in games for 20 years for this. But yeah, I think the most complicated part that actually people struggle with is the economic gameplay, because there's a lot of pushing tokens around and combining them and that kind of more gamey aspects to it, which is really there as the thing for two human beings to be struggling with. The tokens that you see in the middle here represent the amount of trust that the participants have for each other, and you never have quite enough. You're having to work and struggle with that. So that's the role that I wanted for a game economy. But then everything else, the depiction on the cards, understanding like, these characters are trying to have a romance, but they're separate from us. That all seemed to click very easily for people. So. And now I have just a lot of people who want to get a copy of it, and there are only 2 copies in existence. So that's really, I'm feeling the weight of responsibility of like, okay, I have to sort out the production issues, which means making some hard choices about. I know people want this version, but I also feel a little bit of a duty to make a version that's maybe a little bit more replayable, or that I feel more comfortable as selling as an entertainment product that they'll be able to take home and have a longer relationship with than a one-night stand in a gallery.
Yeah. Tell us more about the responsibility you feel about this game, because you've mentioned previously that this game obviously means more to consumers and to yourself than just something that's enjoyable to play. There is something of a message in there.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because I've been approached a number of times by people that want to use it as an educational tool, which my initial reaction was, this is a terrible, terrible idea, because it's somewhat open-ended, right? You could have a terrible experience with this game playing with someone who is very uncommunicative or pushy, just like you could have in any kind of close relationship. And it doesn't have didactic education, right? It doesn't actually tell you how to consent. It's more, when I was developing it, I was thinking of it more as an exercise tool for communication and trust and consent and for self-reflection. Right? So it's something that when people say, oh, this would be great, we want to give it to 12-year-olds to teach them about consent. I'm like, I don't think you can do that, or at least not alone. And fortunately,
has that changed?
Well, I have actually talked to some educators who I think are more savvy at the intersection of doing sex education in games. And I think that the landscape of teachers using games in education has changed quite a bit in maybe the last 15 years, where now there are so many more teachers who understand, okay, we can't just, a game is not a payload that you kind of drop on a classroom and expect it to just burst and educate a bunch of students. It has to be put into context. You have to have discussion around it.
And speaking of education, you are yourself an educator now.
Yeah, that's right. So I have been teaching game design classes to students for the last few years, but, oops, it's not the right slide. But yeah, I recently joined the the faculty of the NYU Game Center in New York, where I'm very privileged to be part of this community, where there's just a lot of great stuff going on. And if you were here earlier this morning, we're very proud of one of the graduates of our program, Winnie Song, and whose game Bad Blood that you saw, and she's also teaching there now. So.
And what are you teaching there?
So I teach a lot of the introductory and intermediate game design courses. So if you see this, where's this picture in the center bottom? That's my colleague Eric Zimmerman leaning over the table. We have a series of classes that really focus on making non-digital games. And so you might think, oh, this is a natural fit because I work on card games, but Consentacle is actually the first card game that I've worked on, first non-digital game in quite some time. That's certainly the first one with commercial potential. But in the Game Center and actually in a number of game design programs where I've taught, we really focus on, I guess, maybe even before you get deeply into working with digital tools, we have students play with cards, with paper, doing prototypes that way, thinking about social relationships. And it's a much quicker way for designers to think about the immediate emotional impact, I think, of their games and the systems they're making on human beings that are sitting right in front of them, rather than having it mediate through code. So we think of it as a great stepping stone. So I teach a lot of those classes, and I also teach a class about the history of independent role-playing games.
I mean, game design is a relatively new field as a kind of formal education thing that you can get a degree in. How has it been for you to kind of forge your path in this as an educator?
I think the biggest challenge is really thinking about, in an art school context, which is NYU Game Center is part of the NYU School of the Arts, what actually is the use of formal education? And I think it's debatable. It's always going to be a bit debatable, and I would never say that it's useful for every game creator to go and pay a large amount of money to get a formal education. But for me, it makes me feel a very, very deep sense of responsibility. Like, okay, I have to be helping somehow for people who do feel like, okay, I want a little bit of structure. I want a place where I can collaborate easily with people, where I have earmarked a bit large chunk of my time to work in this context, in this community on games. What am I actually bringing along with the other faculty to making that a better space? So I think, maybe going back to the getting out of bed in the morning question, for me right now, especially since I've only been working full-time at the Game Center since last fall, I'm like, okay, I have to figure out how to really deepen and enrich the creative process of all the students. And I think that we'll see how that goes. The Game Center has been doing pretty well so far when we look at the games that people are able to make there. And of course, I would say that's maybe 90% the creative spirit and inspiration of people coming into the program. They have it all inside of them. But if any of the classes or the context here, because maybe helped go a little bit further, go over that last 10%, then I think it's worth it. So I'm just always thinking about, how can we help just bridge any of the little gaps inside of your mind? And sometimes that's making suggestions for a game, or actually pushing us to think a little bit differently about the role that games play in our lives, or how to balance between life and work, or struggle with the meaning of our games. Mm-hmm. That's such a fraught topic still.
you have so much other work going on in terms of feminism, a lot of work going on in queering games, queering in games. How has that come into your teaching?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it is a little bit related to Consentacle as well. And it's funny, NYU, our program has a little bit of a reputation for formalism in games, a little bit of a traditional, old school, sort of, going back to some textbooks, Kaiwa and Huizinga and all of these old philosophers. What do they have to say about games? How can we think about games as structures? And I guess, my approach within that context, I know a lot of the people who put the Game Center together, and I've been influenced by a lot of the same works. But let me see if I can find the slide. So my thought has always been, like, what if we take some of these ideas that philosophers or other writers have had about games, and how can we turn them on their head or screw them up? And that I guess is what I think of as my queer games methodology. Very unlike the question of representation of queer people or queer lives in games, it's more like trying to think about how do we denaturalize the processes involved in a game. So this is actually a quote that I quite like from an old book about games by Avedon and Sutton Smith, where it's proposing this very almost scientific, highly logical definition of games. We're talking about voluntary control systems and opposition, trying to produce a disequilibrial outcome. And it's that last part that was actually part of the inspiration for Consentacle that I thought, okay, they say disequilibrial outcome, but part of what's interesting about going to that level of using new terminology, not just saying, well, where one person wins and one person loses, although that's what they were thinking of, right? They were also thinking, oh, well, we need to make this more complex because sometimes you have a race where someone comes in first, second, third, and fourth place, so we can't just say one wins and one loses, or there's sometimes there's a tie, and we have to figure out how to break the tie. So I thought, a disequilibrial outcome could look like you have a flat sheet on a bed, and then you shake it, and now the sheet is rumpled. It's in a different state. So that is works perfectly well as the outcome for a game, too, that we could say that still sort of follows this model, and we could pursue that angle of maybe, I almost think of it as maybe trying to evade bureaucracy. So we're all governed by all of these systems around immigration, like Catherine Neal was just talking about, or education, state control. And I've found in my own life that the most successful method for me in dealing with this has been to bamboozle the government, to trick and commit various types of low-level fraud to get through things like dealing with legal identification and things like that. So I don't see why we shouldn't take the same approach with lower stakes, fortunately, when we're talking about these existing ideas or philosophies around games. So I can say, a disequilibrial outcome, well, that actually, if I interpret what you mean by that differently, I can say, we can produce something like, this is this scoring chart for Consentacle. And I based this off of a quiz from these American magazines like Cosmopolitan, fashion magazines intended for women, where you are taking a personality test, and it kind of tells you like, how much does your boyfriend love you? Oh, he's not that into you, or it scales up to he's yours forever. And so I thought, well, that's also a disequilibrial outcome. It doesn't necessarily mean that one person has to win or lose, because I don't think that's appropriate for a collaborative game about sex. So instead, I make these two scales. Yeah, you can think of this as being a personality test too. And so you find out what the outcome is, and there's a little bit of performance there, a little bit of measuring how collaborative you are, but there's also some personal style in that, and I've seen players express themselves quite differently in terms of, do I want to be really giving? Do I want to be just as giving as my partner? Do we sort of want to, is the goal to really be in balance with each other? Or is it to actually be asymmetrical? And maybe that's what we're both looking for. And so there's often some communication around that as well. Mm-hmm. And this is an approach I've taken in a number of games. I actually worked on a visual novel where, rather than having just positive and negative endings, a lot of what happens is you're making choices, and then they're reflected back at you, so you sort of understand, these are the things that I valued through my choice.
Mm-hmm. through these kinds of works, we see that you really have quite an emphasis on, I don't know how to put it, but maybe social responsibility, social innovation, queering things a little bit, and just throwing some disequilibrium into what we see has been the status quo. Do you think these are political acts?
Yeah, so I guess I would say everything is a political act, right? I think that's come up several times here at Amaze when people are talking about these things, and so you can't really make a non-political game. I think the Tentacle Bento is a good example of that. They didn't, the creators of that game, they weren't meaning to make such a horrible statement about rape. From what I understand, they just kind of accidentally did it because I don't know. They just weren't thinking, or they thought, oh, we're making a joke about this terrible tentacle rape genre, which is, and that's a political mistake, right? And it ends up being a statement whether they like it or not. So I myself, and when I'm talking to students, I'm always trying to encourage them to think about, okay, what is the political meaning of this game that you're making? It's something that I think we're still getting good at. Even some of the smartest people who spend a lot of time thinking about this, like Ian Bogost, who's a writer, critic, philosopher, and game designer in the United States. One of the first games I played by him was this game about working at Kinko's. And I think it's called Disaffected. And so you run a Kinko's in that game. Oh, sorry, good point. Thank you for it. It's a chain of coffee shops in the United States. So it's about being a manager of a photocopy center, and you have a number of employees. And the things that I felt that game expressed were so different from what was intended, just because of the impact of the mechanics and that it had this very strong political message that wasn't exactly lining up with the intents of the creators of that game, who wanted to talk about labor conditions at Kinko's. And it actually, to me, evinced a more sort of management sympathetic position. But I think it raises an interesting question, and I think I have a slide of this in here. Let me see if I can find it. Did I put it in? I may just have to talk about this interesting dichotomy, because I'm not sure if I have this picture. But there's a game that came out a couple years ago in the US called Spent, which was intended to help players understand what it's like to be poor, to be homeless, to be sort of on the brink of not being able to support your family at all, to be sort of struggling to get by. And there was a psychological study that was done on it just a few months ago that found that this game actually makes players much less empathetic towards people in poverty. Just because of the nature of the game, it's presented as a game with a lot of choices where you have a budget, you're having to decide what to buy and what possessions to sell, how you're going to save money. But it makes it appear as if it's a solvable problem where the player has this agency to make it through to the other side and win the game. So that traditional mode of thinking about games works directly against the intent of the game. Because when players got through the other side and were then interviewed and given psychological surveys and tests about taking the point of view of someone in that situation, they felt, oh, well, I was able to figure out how to navigate that simulation. I was able to solve it intellectually. Of course, not having any of the visceral experience of actually living those experiences.
It implicitly equates being poor with being not very bright, or not being very bright at managing. Right,
it's sort of a learn to play kind of attitude towards any kind of situation. I think that this is a problem that a lot of simulations meant to convey experience or present problems have. And actually, I think it's interesting. So Catherine Neal mentioned that this idea of misery simulators, which is the flip side of that coin. If you just present a situation as completely hopeless, then you have a different kind of rhetoric that's almost nihilistic or precludes the possibility of change. But if there's a way to win a game, like, oh, I won poverty, why can't you win poverty? Then you have this other problem. And I think a lot of this bind has to do with ways that we are thinking about games, like what we assume they must have in order to be games or to be satisfying, to provide an experience of fun. And then that, of course, is also bound by the expectations of people that we're trying to give games to, whether it's a purely a free game like Spent that you can play online, where they want to distribute it as widely as possible, but want people to understand it as a game, right? Oh, you want to play this, right? It's fun. Or a commercial game, of course, I think is subject to even more pressures.
Yeah, I want to catch you there and read you a quote that you wrote about. You turned this into a blog post, I think, last May. Somebody left player feedback on, I think it was a Friends game, and this person said, "Look, I'm a gamer, and you ought to know that gamers are the most discerning kind of consumer." I think another one was, "I had to play this level twice. I can't believe you forced me to repeat an experience. This makes me angry. This makes any real gamer angry, and that's just a simple truth." Who is the real gamer?
Yeah, so I was almost morbidly excited when I saw these quotes, because it's so representative of a certain mindset that I think everyone making games who's trying to find some kind of deeper meaning, whether it's personal expression or an artistic vision or a message of some sort, has to contend with this very dominant prevailing attitude, at least if you are making games for anyone but a small and sympathetic audience, which is, of course, very nice and maybe part of why Consentacle has done well, too. But this was a mass market game that was intended to be released on the App Store, and it was just a very, very small thing, the fact that there were multiple goals in the game. There was, sort of a bonus goal that you could accomplish in a level, but this player perceived that it wasn't possible. And I'm not even sure if this is a correct perception. They're like, oh, I would have to play this level again to achieve the bonus goal. And that's what set off this rant, right? And so it's actually, I think, to me, it was a sign that there is a political issue here that has to do with whether games are providing pleasure in the expected manner. That there's a large group of people who feel entitled as players to, when they put money forth, that they're going to receive a service in return. Just like if you pay to have your windows washed, you expect the window to be clean, and like there's no streaks on it. And there's I felt the same kind of anger, but it's politicized too, because this person feels like, oh, you're not respecting who I am. Now this has become a fraught identity because of so many struggles around the gamer identity and how that intersects with representation of women and misogyny and harassment and all the stuff going on. That now that this attitude has become a little bit defensive, like, why aren't you washing my window? Why aren't you, like, I paid for this hamburger, why is it only this thick? But why are you not giving me fun in the way that, of course, any gamer would want?
I think in the same blog post you said a lot of players now are beginning to expect games to be just instant gratification machines. It's like a slot machine. You constantly keep pulling the lever on, and you keep expecting something to happen. And if you don't get that hit of dopamine, you're really pissed.
Yeah, I think it's even more interesting because I think the people who are very attached to being able to receive this type of pleasure, it's not even that they want to be able to hit a button and receive that immediately, right? It's actually quite important to work and labor and then receive a payoff for it, right? So I think that's part of where some of the anger comes from, is like, because the boundaries between play and work blur more and more, especially as we've had more games that involve grinding, which goes into a whole other.
You've made this out quite a bit in your own work. I think you had a lecture delivered on this, building on your blog post. You've made this out to be a problem of taste.
Yeah, and I think that we have taste in games, but it's almost a type of taste or a culture of taste that's been developing blindly in the dark without a lot of thought. And you could say, well, isn't that true of many forms of culture? But if you go back and look, for instance, at, say, the history of, let me see, I've got it here. I like to compare games to food. This is my new favorite metaphor. I find it much more fruitful than talking about film or other media, because in some ways I think games are in terms of age, maybe as old as food. But so I've been comparing, like, the emergence of Italian cuisine and studying some history of that. And then, how long have we actually been writing or talking about video games and video game design? Now, of course, non-digital games are much older than this, but games being produced as a product that's perceived by a consumer as something that they're purchasing in order to get a certain type of feeling, the history is much, much shorter. So for any taste culture, there has been, in most cases, many centuries of thinking about what's important, right? So this book that's on the right side of this slide, La Scienza in Cucina e l'arte di mangiare e bere, is a cookbook that was from around the turn of the 20th century that really is still used today as a kind of a foundation for modern Italian cuisine, and was a point in the development of cuisine where the author Artusi said, okay, we need to not just think about filling people's bellies. We also we want to think about what is seasonal, what is local, what kinds of ingredients can you get fresh, what role does food have in our daily lives and our families, what are the traditions of Italy that are regional or even specific to certain households. So putting all of that into context and saying there's actually more going on here than just please put some food in my mouth so I can swallow it and feel full, which is, I think, maybe a little closer to some of the attitude that we have in games right now, because of an absence of actually thinking about what forms taste.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the bulk of cultural critique and history that is behind food, in the same blog post, you kind of pointed out that games have the opposite problem of food tastes. You have an elitism defined by the absence of taste or simply by bad taste.
Right, and yeah, just by the idea of look, a game is a delivery mechanism for me to receive a certain kind of feeling, and if that doesn't happen, if I don't get the right amount of satisfaction or reward or challenge and then reward, if I have to play a level twice, then you're like a window washer who hasn't washed my window properly, and I'm going to be very angry at you. It's maybe the only way I've been able to understand the levels of rage that some people have about a game not performing to their specifications, because it's certainly not an approach towards an aesthetic experience that is looking to broaden a palette, right? Or saying, oh, this is showing me something really new and unexpected. In fact, it's anger against when there's a deviation from what they thought they could get. Or maybe they're like, oh, I would like something new. I would like a new flavor of crisp or candy, but as long as it still is sweet or salty, right?
Mm-hmm. And you call this an elitism as well, which I find so interesting, because what we're calling this essentially is lowbrow elitism. It's elitism with bad taste.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of a useful point. I was struggling with this actually when I was writing that blog post, because I realized that there are downsides to talking about high and lowbrow taste too, and there's quite a long history of it. So actually, I feel like the problem, at least in the United States, and maybe it's a little different here, but this is from a chef in the U.S., Dan Barber, who talks about why American food is so bad. And that it's kind of the traditional American cuisine. If you subtract the influences of cuisine from other countries, it's really just like, oh, it's a lot of meat and then some potatoes, right? And with a big hunk of bread and maybe some green beans on the side.
Germany.
And he points out that this is maybe actually just because of the overabundance of land that was, of course, seized from Native Americans. And then there was just a large space cleared out for cattle to graze, and for corn and wheat to be grown. And so then you have this cuisine of sort of okay ingredients, but you have a lot of them, so you can serve enormous amounts. And I kind of think that this is related to what's happened to video games over the last several decades, that computing power continues to just grow and grow and grow, so we have increasing capability to do whatever we want. And I think even with fantasies of VR now, this still presents some risk that when you have abundance, it can actually work against taste, because all you do is just sort of pile on more of what seems most attractive, right? Like, oh, of course we want to eat meat, because that's, hundreds of thousands of years ago, what our bodies learned to find very valuable. Like, oh, that's going to be the rare form of nutrition. So, now we can make as much meat as we want. So, of course, we're going to, and that shapes the cuisine. And yeah, I do think of that as being a little bit like lowbrow taste. But I think it's a little more complicated, too. It's maybe assuming that there's this lowest level of taste on this chart that we just assume, okay, well, this is what everyone wants, right? This is what any gamer wants, is for it to be fun and pleasurable. It's a universal, natural thing, and that becomes dominant, as opposed to thinking about, like, well, how is this intersecting with our culture, with our traditions, with the individual course of our lives, and how we've developed tastes, maybe due to the action of our local subcultures or our friends and family. And then up at the top, which I'm not even totally comfortable with this as a hierarchy, because I don't necessarily think that cultivation is better, but that's certainly how it's been talked about for many centuries, that if as an individual we decide that there's a sort of a noble thing we want to move towards, and that was what maybe is considered highbrow taste.
And as a creator and an educator, you're kind of in a position where you may be able to induce good taste. Do you take that role on in any way?
Oh, definitely not. The only thing I think that is really my responsibility as an educator, and I probably differ from a number of my colleagues on this, is just to try and destroy existing stratified tastes, just to open up the space a little bit, to allow a little bit more free movement. Maybe like a masseuse, although that's maybe a bad metaphor for student-teacher relationships. But like if you're very locked, I see some students entering into making games, and they have a very fixed, rigid idea of, well, this is the thing that gave me the most pleasure in a very absorbing way, which is a valuable thing to know. But if you have become tense and rigid in that direction, then you miss out on what else might be valuable or what you might be able to add into that mix, rather than simply duplicating exactly the thing that pushed your buttons.
You've worked in and outside the US, so how does the culture of taste differ across the world? I mean, you have some Japanese heritage. You've also worked at Lego, I believe, in Denmark. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really tricky question. I think it does differ enormously. Actually, one of the most interesting things I came across when I've been sort of doing some research on aesthetics and the culture of food, just dabbling, to try and find metaphors that might be useful for us in games, is that it's assumed that there's this universal systems of tasting food that we could maybe discern and identify. I think I actually have a picture of one of them. Oh, no, I didn't put it in here. But I'll put this up instead, which is actually this is a proposed chart of tastes of coffee. But there's this idea of flavor science now that we can actually identify what flavors pair well together. So, for instance, oysters and pomegranate, because they contain certain molecules that are similar to each other, if you put them together, that you get a certain kind of consonance of taste. And the food scientists who were researching this, even have put together some software tools where you could say, well, these are the ingredients I have. Oh, and they'll propose, like, well, if you went and bought these other 3 ingredients, maybe it's a very unlikely combination with no foundation in any kind of cuisine, but that you would expect chemically for it to be a pleasing combination. But the most fascinating thing I found was that not all cuisines follow these rules, that it's actually not a universal biological thing, that actually Indian cuisine works in a completely different way, that in Indian cuisine, when there are certain spices present, like, say, fenugreek or turmeric, or certain types of chili, that putting these into a dish then sort of changes the combinations that are commonly present with those spices to create more of a counterpoint type of note instead. So you have flavors that are kind of working not just in synchronicity with each other, but coming from very different angles, and that produces the individual flavor of Indian cuisine. So I think that what that points out to me is that we should be very wary of making these universalizing statements, right? And so I see what people think of as tentacle porn and like what its role is in culture, making assumptions about how that works in Japan, on one way or the other, right? The sort of childish stereotype that like, well, everyone in Japan must be weird or a pervert, or the flip side that this must be a secret shame of the culture, right? And the truth is actually somewhat more complicated. That it's a little bit like, it's something you ignore somebody doing out of politeness. That's maybe the closest way I could explain it. But yeah, I mean, I could go on and on with talking about stereotypes about Danish people and what Danish people think of Germans, but
well, maybe just we spoke about this briefly before, but I asked once whether Japanese game designers had an influence on your work or on game design in the States at large, and I think you had quite a number of very interesting things to say about the history of the development of video games emanating from Japan.
Sure, I actually think it's maybe too strong of an influence these days. And this wasn't quite as true when I was first starting to work in the industry. At that time, in the late 90s, a lot of the very established figures in games were most influenced by American computer games of the 80s. But because Nintendo becomes such a strong force by the late 80s in the United States, I think that the generation that came after that, like the folks who were starting to make games in the 2000s and now on into the 2010s, the most common cultural touchstones that I run across in the United States among, I guess, anyone under the age of 30 or 35 and of course this isn't true of everyone, right? But if you were to survey a very large crowd of players and developers, that this sort of Mario, Zelda, Samus Aran axis is almost too predominant, which is interesting because I also grew up with those games and I was playing on the Famicom when I was much younger, and actually when I returned to the United States was before that stuff had arrived in the U.S. So I was 11 years old and telling people very excitedly about these games that they had in Japan. But then I think it's almost become it's a super prominent flavor, and I think it's actually a testament to how young and fragile the accretion of taste is in games, that you could have a nascent culture growing in the United States in the 80s, and also actually quite independently in Europe in the 80s, and then have this tidal wave of Japanese product kind of sweep over everything and kind of alter a whole generation's tastes. Mm-hmm. And I quite like Japanese games, and they were certainly instrumental in developing my taste in video games when I was younger. But then, by the late 2000s, it was they were prevalent enough as signifiers of taste, or sort of an inside knowledge within this very large sphere of people making games, that you had folks like Jonathan Blow saying, "Oh, Japanese games are dead. They're soulless husks now. Like, we should be looking away from Japan." So, so nowadays I actually think that Japan unfortunately has become a bit of a backwater for the game industry, and has had a little bit of trouble being agile enough to keep up with developments elsewhere, at least at the large end of their industry. But fortunately, I think that breakup has helped, in the last 10 years or so, really invigorate the indie scene there.
Mm-hmm. Would it be, this is a bit of a doozy to ask in the last 4 minutes, but would it be appropriate to say, has there been any kind of cultural appropriation, taking elements out of Japanese game design without, properly crediting it? I know this is quite a prevalent discussion in the States these days when it comes to culture, pop culture, what's been taken from native cultures, and so on. Would it be appropriate to use such a term?
Oh, that is a bit of a doozy of a question. It's interesting. I think it's hard to talk about that question without talking about the broader scope of nerd culture and how Japanese culture, from anime to video games, that whole blend has been such a huge influence on the United States in particular. Maybe also here, although I don't know as much about your context here. But there's certainly a very large contingent of young American creators, mostly in their 20s, who clearly that Japanese anime and video games are one of their strongest cultural influences. And I think that on the positive side, the folks that I see going on to create their own games out of that culture, they tend to also be doing a lot of remixing and tend to be sort of thinking rather politically about what it means that they have Japanese influence in their games. Maybe it's because I'm only sort of aware of the most interesting creators, but yeah, I think when you look at sort of James Harvey's comic art style and how it's definitely influenced by anime, but it's also quite distinct, right? So that's where I think it no longer stops making sense to talk about cultural appropriation when we just have some visual style influences. I think of Japan when it comes to this particular type of culture, video games, animation, as actually being more of an imperialist force, since the export of that culture has been such a strong part of the Japanese culture industry for some time now, but acting in a way where Japan doesn't really feel the need to consider the impact or even that much of the audience reception in other countries that all of these sort of finished goods are being exported to, right? And that is that's actually sort of follows the colonial model more closely, even though Japan doesn't have political power in the United States. There's still such a large culture import that culture export from Japan that. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can see, like a generation of American kids being so strongly influenced by that stuff as appropriation rather than like, a bunch of people in Japan made a lot of money off of the fact that you guys all love this stuff and have become imprinted on it.
Is it problematic?
Yes, everything is problematic.
Everything. Yeah. Well, we have 3 minutes. No? Okay. Well,
out of time? Okay.
I think we've run out of time for doozies. Thank you, Naomi, for coming and
pleasure.
answering doozy questions at Amaze and Berlin. And thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for listening to our rambling conversation.